January 17th, 1943. The frozen earth of Stalingrad cracked under Wehrmacht boots like broken glass. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner adjusted his grip on the Kar-98K, the metal so cold it burned through his wool gloves. Snow drifted between the skeletal remains of apartment buildings, carrying the metallic scent of cordite and something else, something that made veteran soldiers pause mid-step. Subscribe to discover how battlefield psychology shaped the Eastern Front's deadliest encounters. Brenner had fought the British at El Alamein, where tea breaks interrupted artillery barrages and prisoners received cigarettes with their questioning. He'd faced American paratroopers in Sicily, where chewing gum wrappers marked foxholes and jazz music drifted from field radios during lulls. But here, in this maze of rubble and twisted steel, the rules dissolved into something primitive. The sound reached him first, not the familiar whistle of incoming shells or the rhythmic clatter of machine gun fire. This was different, a low, guttural chanting that seemed to rise from the earth itself, punctuated by the scrape of metal against stone. Brenner's platoon had been advancing through the factory district for 3 hours without encountering resistance, which should have been reassuring. Instead, every empty window frame felt like a waiting mouth. Hauptmann Dietrich raised his fist, halting the column. 23 men dropped into defensive positions among the debris, their breath forming small clouds in the -20 air. The chanting grew louder, more distinct now, Russian voices, but not the disciplined cadence of regular army formations Brenner remembered from the early months of Barbarossa. This carried the weight of something older, more fundamental. The first Soviet soldier appeared at the end of the street like a materialization from the shadows themselves. His uniform hung in tatters, patched with canvas and rope, but his PPSH-41 gleamed with meticulous care. Behind him came another, then 3 more, moving with the fluid coordination of wolves tracking wounded prey. No formation flags, no officer insignia visible, just the red star painted in what looked suspiciously like dried blood on their helmets. Brenner had read the intelligence reports. These weren't the same conscripts who'd surrendered by the thousands during the Wehrmacht's initial advance. Something had changed in the months since Moscow, since Leningrad, since the first winter offensive. The men approaching through the ruins moved with a purpose that transcended military doctrine, their eyes holding the flat intensity of predators who'd forgotten the difference between hunting and surviving. The lead Soviet raised his weapon with deliberate slowness, and Brenner noticed the man's fingers, frostbitten black at the tips, yet steady as a surgeon's. Behind him, more figures emerged from positions that shouldn't have existed, from cover that hadn't been there moments before. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Brenner could hear his own pulse in his ears. Dietrich's voice cut through the stillness with parade ground precision. Orders to establish a firing line, to maintain discipline, to remember their training. Standard Wehrmacht tactics that had rolled across Poland, France, and half of Russia. But as Brenner shifted into position, muscle memory guiding his movements, he noticed something that made his stomach clench with unfamiliar dread. The Soviet soldiers weren't taking cover. They stood exposed in the open street, weapons lowered, watching the German positions with the patience of men who understood that victory wasn't measured in tactical advantages or superior equipment. Their stillness radiated a kind of certainty that Brenner had never encountered in 2 years of combat. Not confidence in their cause or their training, but something deeper. The absolute knowledge that they would be here when the sun set, no matter what happened in between. One of the Russians, a sergeant by the look of his torn sleeve stripes, began walking forward, not advancing tactically, not seeking cover or concealment, simply walking, his boots crunching through the snow with the measured pace of a man crossing a village square on a Sunday morning. His comrades followed, spreading out but maintaining that same unhurried stride, as if enemy weapons were merely an inconvenience to be endured rather than feared. Brenner's finger found the trigger guard. Beside him, Gefreiter Stein muttered something about crazy Ivans, but his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there during the Africa campaigns. These weren't the same Soviets who'd broken and fled during the summer advances, leaving behind equipment and positions in panicked retreat. These men moved like they owned the ruins, like every shattered brick and twisted girder was personal territory being reclaimed. The metallic scraping sound resumed, and Brenner realized it wasn't random noise, it was synchronized. Each Soviet soldier dragged something against the rubble as they advanced, creating a rhythm that matched their footsteps. Bayonets against stone, belt buckles against steel reinforcement bars, the deliberate percussion of men who'd turned warfare into a ritual. Dietrich's command echoed off the building facades, sharp and clear. The platoon's rifles rose in unison, 23 barrels tracking 23 targets. Standard engagement range, textbook positioning, overwhelming firepower advantage. Every element of the tactical situation favored the Wehrmacht forces, just as it had in a dozen previous encounters across 3 different theaters of war. But as Brenner aligned his sights on the approaching sergeant, he felt something he'd never experienced facing British commandos or American Rangers, the certainty that superior tactics and training might not be enough. The Soviet soldiers continued their steady advance, and their eyes held the kind of resolve that came from men who'd already died once and found it less frightening than expected. The metallic scrape of ammunition being counted echoed through the bunker as Oberst Heinrich Müller examined intelligence reports spread across the makeshift table. Outside, December wind howled across the Polish plains, carrying the distant rumble of artillery from 3 different directions. American forces pressed from the west, British units maneuvered through the northern sectors, and somewhere beyond the frozen Vistula, Soviet divisions gathered like storm clouds. Muller's adjutant entered, boots crunching on frost that had formed inside their concrete shelter. The young lieutenant carried dispatches marked with the red stamps of urgent priority, his breath forming white puffs in the bitter air. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins representing enemy movements that seemed to shift daily, like pieces on an enormous chessboard. The first dispatch detailed American reconnaissance probes near Poznan. Standard procedure, Muller noted, methodical artillery preparation, tank advances supported by air cover, infantry following established doctrine. Predictable patterns that German defensive planners had studied extensively throughout the war. The Americans fought with overwhelming material advantage but within recognizable parameters. British operations northeast of their position followed similar logic. Montgomery's forces advanced with characteristic caution, establishing supply lines before major pushes, coordinating closely with armored divisions. Their tactics reflected institutional memory, spanning decades of colonial campaigns and European warfare. Dangerous opponents, certainly, but operating within familiar frameworks. The third dispatch carried different implications entirely. Soviet forces beyond the Vistula had begun what intelligence suggested was final preparation for winter offensive operations. But reports from captured prisoners described something unprecedented. Entire rifle divisions stripped of standard equipment, soldiers carrying only essential weapons and minimal supplies. No heavy artillery preparation, no obvious supply concentrations. Mueller studied aerial reconnaissance photographs showing Soviet positions, where American and British sectors revealed extensive logistical networks, fuel dumps, ammunition stockpiles, field hospitals positioned at regulation distances. Soviet areas appeared almost empty. Intelligence officers had initially dismissed early reports as reconnaissance failures or deliberate deception. Through frozen ground, the same metallic scraping sound drifted from distant positions where German soldiers prepared their own defenses. Müller had served on the Eastern Front since 1941, witnessing campaigns that redefined warfare itself. Yet something about current Soviet preparations felt fundamentally different from previous operations. A communications specialist approached with decoded intercepts from Soviet radio traffic. The messages revealed coordination between units identified as punishment battalions, penal companies, and regular rifle divisions. Orders mentioned night movement without artillery support, approach routes through terrain considered impassable for conventional operations. Most unsettling were references to objectives that made no tactical sense according to established military doctrine. The intercepts described Soviet infantry units advancing without predetermined withdrawal routes, carrying supplies for extended periods behind enemy lines, operating independently of traditional command structures. American and British forces maintained constant radio contact with headquarters, requested specific support, followed established protocols for engagement and disengagement. Soviet communications suggested entirely different operational philosophy. Mueller examined casualty reports from recent engagements with all 3 Allied forces. American and British losses followed predictable patterns, higher when caught in prepared positions, lower when superior firepower could be brought to bear. But Soviet casualties seemed almost irrelevant to their operational planning. Units that suffered devastating losses simply reorganized remaining personnel and continued advancing. Weather reports predicted the harshest winter conditions in recent memory. American and British forces had already begun reducing patrol activity, consolidating positions for sustained cold weather operations. Historical precedent suggested major offensive operations would be postponed until spring. German defensive planning had incorporated these seasonal considerations since the campaign's beginning. Soviet forces showed no indication of seasonal adjustment. Intelligence suggested they were actually increasing activity as temperatures dropped, conducting training exercises in conditions that would halt conventional military operations. The metallic scraping sound seemed to intensify as wind carried it across frozen ground, like countless soldiers sharpening bayonets in the gathering darkness. Reports from the Crimean and Stalingrad campaigns described Soviet infantry tactics that defied conventional understanding. Individual soldiers advancing alone across open ground, small groups infiltrating through positions considered secure, attacks continuing despite losses that would cause other armies to withdraw immediately. But current intelligence suggested even those precedents were inadequate preparation. Muller's staff officers had begun referring to Soviet forces differently than American or British opponents. Maps marking enemy positions used different symbols, colored pins arranged in patterns that reflected uncertainty about actual strength and intentions. Standard intelligence categories seemed inadequate for describing formations that operated according to principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about military organization. The communications specialist returned with additional intercepts, suggesting Soviet units were being resupplied by methods that circumvented traditional logistics entirely. No visible supply convoys, no established depot networks, no recognizable maintenance procedures. Yet somehow, rifle divisions continued operating at full strength, despite occupying positions that should have been unsustainable. As evening approached, the metallic scraping sound grew more distinct, now clearly recognizable as the methodical preparation of edged weapons. Not the routine maintenance performed by professional soldiers, but something more deliberate, more personal. Muller understood that his forces faced three different types of warfare simultaneously, each requiring different defensive strategies, different psychological preparation. Intelligence reports concluded with assessments that would shape the coming campaign's darkest hours. American and British forces represented formidable but comprehensible threats, superior numbers and equipment applied through familiar tactical frameworks. Soviet forces represented something unprecedented in modern warfare, an enemy whose operational principles seemed to transcend conventional military logic entirely. The metallic scrape of entrenching tools against frozen earth echoed across the Stalingrad suburbs as dawn broke on November 15, 1942. German Obergefreiter Klaus Müller pressed his back against the concrete wall of a half-demolished apartment building, watching Soviet infantry advance through the industrial district with movements that defied everything he had learned about warfare. The sound of steel meeting ice would return to haunt him in ways he could not yet imagine. Müller had fought against British commandos in Norway, traded fire with American paratroopers in Sicily, yet nothing had prepared him for this methodical advance of Red Army soldiers who seemed to treat death as merely another tactical consideration. They moved through the rubble-strewn streets with an economy of motion that suggested not recklessness, but calculation, refined by necessity. Through his field glasses, Müller observed a Soviet lieutenant directing his men around the skeletal remains of Factory Building 7. The officers' movements were deliberate, unhurried despite the morning bombardment that had preceded their assault. When machine gun fire erupted from the third floor of a nearby structure, the lieutenant did not dive for cover, as British officers had done at Narvik. Instead, he studied the muzzle flashes, made quick hand gestures to his squad, and continued forward while two of his men flanked the position. The tactical manual Müller carried in his breast pocket described Soviet infantry as poorly trained peasants, driven forward by political commissars and blocking detachments. Yet what he witnessed contradicted every assumption the Wehrmacht had made about their Eastern adversaries. These soldiers moved with the fluid precision of men who had learned warfare not from textbooks, but from survival. Soviet Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov crouched behind a pile of twisted steel girders, feeling the November wind cut through the gaps in his winter coat. The metallic scrape of German boots on concrete drifted from the building ahead, punctuated by hushed voices speaking in the familiar cadences of the fatherland. He had learned to distinguish between different enemy accents during the past month of urban fighting. Bavarians moved differently than Prussians, spoke differently, died differently. Petrov's platoon had been reduced from 38 men to 19 during the previous week's fighting, yet their effectiveness had somehow increased rather than diminished. Each loss had been absorbed, analyzed, converted into tactical knowledge that made the survivors more dangerous. When Private Kozlov had died clearing the post office, his death had taught them 3 new approaches to room clearing that now kept others alive. The British prisoners they had encountered during the brief Arctic campaign spoke of warfare as a temporary interruption of civilized life, something to be endured and concluded as quickly as possible. American soldiers, in the accounts, Petrov had heard from comrades who fought in Lend-Lease operations, approached combat with technological confidence. Superior equipment would overcome inferior numbers, but Soviet infantry had learned to view warfare as a natural state, requiring adaptation rather than domination. Muller watched as 3 Soviet soldiers worked their way through the bombed-out pharmacy below his position. Their movements demonstrated a patience that unnerved him more than any frontal assault. One man would advance 10 meters, establish cover, provide overwatch, while the second moved forward. The third soldier would remain stationary until both others had secured new positions, then advance to a point that created interlocking fields of fire. This methodical approach consumed time but preserved lives, and Muller began to understand why Soviet casualties in urban fighting had dropped dramatically since September. German intelligence had initially interpreted this as evidence of weakening Soviet resolve, but the opposite proved true. The Red Army had learned to fight smart rather than hard, converting tactical patience into strategic advantage. Petrov studied the apartment building where German voices continued their muted conversation. His orders specified clearing the structure room by room, but experience suggested a different approach. The building's foundation had been weakened by previous bombardments. Structural cracks ran along the eastern wall where winter frost had penetrated. Rather than assault the position directly, Petrov's squad could undermine the building's stability, forcing the occupants to relocate or face collapse. This method required more time than a direct assault, but it virtually guaranteed success while minimizing Soviet casualties. German doctrine emphasized rapid decision-making and aggressive action, qualities that served well in mobile warfare, but became liabilities in urban combat where patience and persistence determined outcomes. The metallic scraping sound resumed as Petrov's engineers began their work on the foundation supports, each calculated strike bringing the building closer to structural failure. German voices grew more agitated as dust began falling from the ceiling above, but by then retreat had become their only viable option. Muller felt vibrations through the concrete floor as something shifted in the building's foundation. His combat experience told him what was happening. Soviet engineers were undermining their position with the same methodical precision he had observed in their infantry tactics. The British would have attempted a frontal assault on the building, accepting casualties to achieve rapid results. Americans would have called for artillery support, using superior firepower to neutralize the position from a distance. But Soviet forces had learned to fight like the city itself, patient, persistent, grinding down opposition through accumulated pressure rather than dramatic gestures. They treated urban warfare not as a series of discrete engagements, but as a continuous process of systematic demolition. As dust clouds began obscuring visibility inside the apartment building, Muller gathered his equipment and prepared for withdrawal. The tactical initiative had shifted without a single shot being fired, transferred through engineering expertise and strategic patience rather than superior numbers or equipment. Petrov watched German soldiers evacuate the compromised building, their withdrawal conducted with professional efficiency despite the circumstances. He felt no satisfaction in their retreat. Urban warfare provided few moments for celebration. The metallic scraping of tools against concrete had resumed behind him as his men prepared the next position, already anticipating the German counterattack that would inevitably follow. The sound had become the rhythm of Stalingrad's destruction and reconstruction, repeated endlessly as both armies adapted to the demands of fighting in a city that refused to die completely. Each engagement taught new lessons. Each casualty provided new tactical insights. Each position gained or lost added to the accumulated knowledge that would determine the battle's ultimate outcome. Muller's squad had withdrawn 300 meters to a more defensible position in the chemical plant complex, but he knew the respite would be temporary. Soviet forces would continue their methodical advance, applying pressure at multiple points until German defenses reached their breaking point. The process would consume weeks rather than hours, but its outcome had become predictable. As evening approached and temperatures dropped below freezing, both armies prepared for another night of calculated attrition, knowing that survival depended not on heroic gestures, but on tactical patience and the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned to make warfare their permanent profession. The metallic clang of shovel against frozen earth echoed across the defensive positions. Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffmann scraped ice crystals from his rifle sight, the familiar ritual that had become second nature during these bitter January weeks of 1943. Around him, the men of the 23rd Infantry Division worked methodically, deepening their trenches in the approaches to Velikiye Luki. The sound of distant engines drifted through the morning fog, a low, grinding rumble that made several soldiers pause in their digging. Hoffmann recognized it immediately. T-34 tanks, their distinctive diesel engines unmistakable after months of fighting. But something else accompanied the mechanical noise, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to pulse through the frozen ground itself. Lieutenant Weber emerged from the command bunker, field glasses pressed to his eyes. His weathered face bore the gaunt expression common to all Wehrmacht officers who had survived the Eastern Front. The intelligence reports spread across his makeshift desk told a story that contradicted everything they had been taught about Soviet capabilities. The Third Shock Army had regrouped faster than anticipated. General Perkayev's forces displayed a coordination that German tactical manuals insisted was impossible for Red Army units. Yet, here they were, massing for what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated assault on the city's outer defenses. Hoffmann watched his squad leader, Unteroffizier Steiner, distribute the morning rations. The veteran's movements were economical, practiced, but his eyes kept darting toward the eastern tree line. Steiner had fought at Stalingrad before his transfer north. He possessed an intuitive understanding of Soviet tactics that the younger replacements lacked. "They're different," Steiner had told them during the previous night's watch. "Not like the reports from France or Africa. These ones don't break when you expect them to." The morning briefing confirmed what many already suspected. Soviet infantry had penetrated the outer perimeter during the pre-dawn hours, establishing footholds in 3 separate sectors. The infiltration had been executed with surgical precision, no mass charges, no wasteful frontal assaults. Instead, small units had moved through gaps in the wire, neutralizing strong points with coordinated efficiency. Major Kellner spread the tactical maps across the wooden crates that served as his planning table. The red arrows marking Soviet positions formed a pattern that troubled him deeply. This wasn't the crude sledgehammer approach described in Wehrmacht training manuals. The enemy was demonstrating tactical sophistication that matched or exceeded German standards. The metallic clang returned, closer now, the sound of entrenching tools working systematically through the frozen soil. Soviet engineers were establishing firing positions within small arms range of the German lines. Each scrape of metal against ice represented another, prepared position, another calculated advantage in the coming engagement. Radio chatter from the divisional headquarters painted a broader picture. Similar infiltration tactics had succeeded across multiple sectors of Army Group North's defensive zone. The pattern suggested centralized planning and coordinated execution on a scale that challenged fundamental assumptions about Red Army capabilities. Hoffmann adjusted his position behind the parapet, checking sight lines toward the suspected Soviet positions. The landscape offered numerous concealment opportunities: shell craters, abandoned farmhouses, scattered equipment from earlier battles. An experienced enemy could use this terrain to devastating effect. The temperature had dropped overnight, turning puddles into sheets of ice that cracked underfoot. Steam rose from the soldiers' breath as they worked, creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air. These conditions favored defenders traditionally, but the previous night's infiltrations had neutralized many defensive advantages. Steiner moved along the trench line, inspecting weapons and ammunition supplies. His methodical approach reflected years of combat experience, but something in his manner suggested deeper concern. The Soviet tactics observed during recent engagements didn't match established patterns. The enemy was adapting faster than anticipated. Field telephone reports from adjacent units described similar developments. Soviet forces were demonstrating enhanced coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor elements. The seamless integration of combined arms tactics indicated training and leadership capabilities that exceeded previous assessments. The morning fog began lifting, revealing details of the surrounding terrain that had remained hidden during the night hours. Fresh tracks in the snow marked paths that hadn't existed the previous evening. Soviet reconnaissance had been active, mapping approaches and identifying weak points in the German defensive scheme. Major Kellner studied the intelligence summaries forwarded from Corps headquarters. Prisoner interrogations revealed information that contradicted established beliefs about Red Army organization. Soviet units were displaying initiative and tactical flexibility that suggested fundamental changes in training and doctrine. The metallic clang echoed once more across the frozen battlefield, but now Hoffman recognized its true significance. It wasn't just the sound of entrenchment, it was the methodical preparation of an enemy that had learned to fight with calculated precision rather than desperate courage alone. The metallic tang of spent gunpowder hung in the frozen air above Stalingrad's skeletal remains. February 1943. Sergeant Klaus Weber pressed his back against a concrete slab, feeling ice crystals form where his breath met the stone. 3 blocks away, Soviet machine gun positions maintained their relentless rhythm, a sound that had become the city's heartbeat. If you've ever wondered how warfare shapes the human spirit, stay with us as we uncover what made these battles legendary. Weber had survived Normandy 2 years earlier, where American Sherman tanks rolled forward with methodical precision. Clean advances, coordinated artillery strikes, overwhelming material advantage. The Wehrmacht had retreated in good order, casualties manageable, equipment salvaged where possible, professional warfare between professional armies. But Stalingrad operated under different rules. Private Heinrich Müller crawled through the rubble beside him, dragging their last belt of ammunition. The 19-year-old's hands shook not from cold, but from what he'd witnessed in the factory district. Soviet infantry didn't advance. They emerged. From sewers, from collapsed basements, from positions that shouldn't have existed. When cornered, they fought with entrenching tools and broken rifle stocks. When ammunition ran low, they continued with bayonets. When bayonets broke, they used their hands. "Sergeant," Muller whispered, "the 24th Panzer reports American forces have broken through near Kasserine Pass in Tunisia." Weber nodded without surprise. American tactical doctrine emphasized firepower over close combat. Their infantry advanced behind rolling barrages, supported by aircraft, supplied by endless convoys. When resistance stiffened, they called for more artillery rather than pressing forward with small arms. Sensible warfare, predictable warfare. The Soviet method defied prediction. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov had learned this method in the ruins of his hometown, watching German tanks roll past his hiding place in September 1941. The Wehrmacht machine functioned with Germanic efficiency, supply lines extending eastward like veins, tactical manuals dictating responses to various scenarios, officers making calculated decisions based on training and doctrine. Volkov's training consisted of survival. He advanced through Stalingrad's underground tunnel system, leading 12 men from his rifle company. The tunnels connected basements, sewers, and metro construction sites into an invisible network. German maps showed surface streets and identified strong points, but failed to account for this subterranean maze. The sound of boots echoed from above, methodical German patrol patterns. Volkov recognized the rhythm. During the Moscow offensive, Wehrmacht units had maintained similar discipline even in retreat. They withdrew to prepared positions, established fields of fire, coordinated with adjacent units. Everything by the manual. British forces in North. Africa displayed comparable professionalism. Montgomery's 8th Army advanced across the desert with meticulous planning, extensive reconnaissance, overwhelming artillery preparation. When Rommel's Africa Corps counterattacked, British units fell back to predetermined positions, regrouped according to doctrine, then resumed their methodical advance. Soviet doctrine emphasized different principles. Volkov's men emerged from a bombed-out pharmacy, positioning themselves in shell craters that provided concealment but no comfort. The frozen ground transmitted vibrations from German tank movements 6 blocks away. American armor in Tunisia moved with similar mechanical precision. Advance, halt, coordinate, advance again. Each movement telegraphed by radio chatter, supply columns, and reconnaissance flights. The metallic tang returned stronger now, carried by wind that whistled through destroyed apartment blocks. Weber recognized that specific scent, cordite mixed with concrete dust and something else, something that distinguished Eastern Front battles from Western encounters. Private Muller pointed toward the pharmacy. "Movement, Sergeant. Should we call for artillery support?" Weber considered the option. In Normandy, such decisions followed established procedures. Observe, report, coordinate fire support, advance under covering fire. American forces employed identical methods with devastating effectiveness. British units refined the system further, incorporating lessons from North African campaigns. But artillery shells were precious commodities in Stalingrad. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of contested territory. Every round fired here couldn't be fired elsewhere. Meanwhile, Soviet forces seemed to multiply regardless of casualties taken. "Save the ammunition," Weber decided. "We'll handle this at squad level." Volkov heard German voices conferring in the street above. He recognized the language patterns: professional discussion, tactical assessment, methodical decision-making. Western Allied forces exhibited similar characteristics. Rational commanders making rational decisions based on rational doctrine. But rationality assumes certain parameters. Volkov's parameters had changed when German artillery destroyed his village school, while children attended classes inside. Again when Wehrmacht logistics units burned grain stores that could have fed his neighbors through winter. Again when retreating German forces executed civilians suspected of partisan sympathies. Personal stakes transformed tactical calculations. Weber advanced with his squad toward the pharmacy, using standard urban warfare techniques learned in training manuals. Covering fire, coordinated movement, systematic clearing procedures. The same methods that proved effective against American positions in Tunisia, where enemy forces responded according to recognizable patterns. Soviet infantry patterns defied recognition. Volkov's men waited until German soldiers entered the pharmacy's main room before initiating contact. But instead of establishing firing positions and engaging at distance, standard military practice, they closed immediately to hand-to-hand range. Rifles became clubs, grenades were held until the last possible second. Wounded soldiers continued fighting until physically incapable. The engagement lasted 43 minutes. When silence returned, both sides had suffered casualties that would normally trigger tactical withdrawal. American or British units facing equivalent losses would reorganize, request reinforcements, await artillery support. Volkov's survivors melted back into the tunnel system, already planning their next engagement. Weber dragged Private Muller to safety behind a concrete barrier, assessing wounds that would require immediate medical attention. The young soldier had fought bravely according to manual specifications, following proper fire and movement techniques, maintaining unit cohesion under pressure. "Sergeant," Muller gasped, "why don't they retreat when they're beaten?" The question haunted Wehrmacht veterans across the Eastern Front. American forces withdrew when tactical situations became untenable, regrouping for renewed offensives under better conditions. British commanders demonstrated similar pragmatism, preserving experienced personnel for future operations. Soviet forces operated under different mathematics. For Volkov and his men, retreat meant abandoning Stalingrad to enemy occupation. It meant accepting that German administrators would reorganize Soviet territory according to Nazi racial theories. It meant conceding that Wehrmacht victories could reshape the fundamental nature of their civilization. Such stakes transformed ordinary soldiers into something beyond normal military categories. The metallic tang intensified as evening approached, mingling with smoke from burning buildings and the peculiar odor of a city slowly dying. Weber realized that scent would follow him forever, not just the chemistry of combat, but the specific combination that marked Eastern Front warfare as fundamentally different from other theaters. In Tunisia and later in Normandy, battles were fought between professional armies pursuing strategic objectives. Casualties were regrettable but acceptable costs of achieving military goals. Victory meant forcing enemy withdrawal, occupying territory, compelling political accommodation. In Stalingrad, battles were fought between incompatible visions of human organization. Volkov emerged from the tunnels after midnight, leading fresh reinforcements to positions recently vacated by casualties. The city's ruins provided endless defensive opportunities for soldiers willing to accept personal destruction as an acceptable price for tactical success. That willingness, Weber finally understood, was what German soldiers had learned to fear. not superior Soviet equipment or tactical innovation, but the mathematical reality that enemy infantry would continue fighting beyond any reasonable calculation of cost and benefit. American and British forces fought with professional competence constrained by rational limitations. Soviet infantry fought as if limitations didn't exist. The metallic tang would intensify tomorrow and the day after until one side finally exhausted its capacity for continuation. Weber suspected he knew which side possessed the deeper reserves of determination. Muller's question echoed in his mind as dawn approached over Stalingrad's frozen wasteland, where the true nature of warfare was being redefined by soldiers who refused to acknowledge defeat. January 20th, 1943. The metallic clanking of Soviet PPSH-41 submachine guns echoed through the frozen streets of Stalingrad's factory district. Feldwebel Klaus Weber pressed his back against the remnants of a brick wall, ice crystals forming on his stubbled chin as his breath mingled with the acrid smoke drifting from destroyed buildings. The sound returned, that distinctive rattling that had haunted German positions for weeks. Weber's platoon had held this intersection for 3 days. Ammunition ran low. Food had become a distant memory. Yet it wasn't hunger that gnawed at him most. It was the methodical approach of Soviet infantry units, their movements coordinated with a precision that contradicted everything Wehrmacht intelligence had predicted about Russian capabilities. The first assault came at dawn. Soviet soldiers emerged from rubble-filled basements 50 meters away, their white camouflage uniforms rendering them nearly invisible against the snow-covered debris. Weber watched through his rifle scope as they advanced in small groups, each covering the other with practiced efficiency. No wild charges, no desperate attacks. Just calculated, relentless pressure. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Kruger crawled beside Weber, his uniform torn and blackened with soot. Through hand signals, he indicated enemy movement in the adjacent building. Weber nodded, recognizing the pattern they had witnessed repeatedly over recent weeks. Soviet infantrymen would occupy positions, establish overlapping fields of fire, then systematically eliminate German strongpoints one by one. The clanking sound grew closer, Soviet soldiers checking their weapons, ensuring magazines seated properly in their submachine guns. Weber had fought against British forces in North Africa, where engagements followed predictable patterns. Tommy attacks came with artillery preparation, methodical advances, and clear tactical doctrine. American forces in Sicily displayed overwhelming firepower, but relied heavily on air support and material superiority. This was different. Soviet infantry fought with an intensity that transcended military training. Weber observed a Russian sergeant directing his squad's movement through the factory ruins. The man's face bore the weathered marks of countless battles, his eyes scanning terrain with predatory focus. When machine gun fire erupted from a German position, the Soviet soldiers didn't retreat or seek heavy weapon support. They flanked the position using building foundations as cover, coordinated their assault with hand signals, and eliminated the threat through direct action. Snow began falling again, heavy flakes that muffled sound and reduced visibility. Weber adjusted his grip on his Gewehr 43, feeling the familiar weight of the semi-automatic rifle. Through his scope, he tracked individual Soviet soldiers as they moved between positions. Their equipment appeared inferior, simple uniforms, basic weapons, minimal protective gear, yet their tactical execution surpassed anything he had encountered on other fronts. A Soviet sniper's bullet struck the wall inches from Weber's head, sending brick fragments across his helmet. He ducked instinctively, recognizing the shooter's position in a collapsed building 200 meters away. The Russian had waited patiently, allowing Weber to expose himself while observing Soviet movements. Professional, disciplined, lethal. Kruger signaled toward their left flank, where Soviet infantry had infiltrated German positions under cover of falling snow. Weber counted at least 12 enemy soldiers moving through the factory complex, their advance coordinated despite lacking radio communication. They used terrain expertly, exploiting every depression and destroyed structure to maintain concealment. The clanking resumed as Soviet forces prepared for another phase of their assault. Weber recognized the sound now, not just weapons being checked, but the systematic preparation of experienced infantrymen who understood urban warfare intimately. These weren't conscripts driven forward by commissars. These were veteran soldiers executing complex tactical maneuvers with minimal resources. A grenade explosion shattered windows in the building behind Weber's position. Soviet infantry had approached within throwing distance without detection. The blast was followed immediately by submachine gun fire as Russian soldiers stormed the building's ground floor. Weber heard German voices shouting commands, then silence. Through his rifle scope, Weber observed the Soviet assault team emerging from the captured building. They moved with purpose, already identifying the next tactical objective. No celebration, no pause to consolidate gains. Just continuous, methodical pressure that gradually compressed German defensive positions into smaller pockets. The temperature dropped as afternoon shadows lengthened across the factory district. Weber's hands grew numb despite his gloves, making precise shooting increasingly difficult. Soviet soldiers seemed unaffected by the cold, their movements remaining fluid and coordinated. They had adapted to winter conditions that devastated German units, unprepared for extended combat in sub-zero temperatures. Kruger pointed toward the main factory building, where muzzle flashes indicated intense fighting. German forces were withdrawing from positions they had held for days, not due to overwhelming enemy numbers, but because Soviet infantry systematically eliminated each defensive strongpoint through superior tactical execution. Weber witnessed the pattern repeatedly. Russian soldiers would identify German positions, coordinate attacks using minimal resources, then exploit success immediately. The metallic clanking echoed once more through the frozen streets, now accompanied by the sound of Soviet boots crunching through snow. Weber realized their current position had become untenable. Enemy forces had maneuvered around German flanks while maintaining frontal pressure, executing a textbook tactical envelopment without radio coordination or heavy weapons support. As darkness approached, Weber prepared to withdraw with the remnants of his platoon. The Soviet infantry he had observed throughout the day represented something beyond conventional military training. They fought with personal investment in victory that transcended tactical doctrine. Each soldier understood his role in larger operations, while maintaining individual initiative that kept German commanders constantly reactive. The sound of approaching Soviet forces grew louder as Weber and Kruger abandoned their position, moving through rubble-filled streets toward German lines deeper in the city. Behind them, the methodical advance continued, marked by that distinctive clanking that had become the soundtrack of German retreat in Stalingrad's frozen wasteland. The frozen earth beneath Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner's boots cracked with each step as he moved through the skeletal remains of what had once been a village near Stalingrad. December 1942 had turned the world into crystalline death. Ice particles hung in the air like suspended needles, catching what little light filtered through the perpetual gray canopy above. The metallic scrape of his Kar 98K rifle against his frost-stiffened fingers reminded him of his grandfather's butcher shop, steel on bone, precise and unforgiving. This sound would haunt him, though he didn't know it yet. Brenner's unit, the 24th Panzer Division, had been retreating for 3 weeks. Not the organized withdrawal they had been promised, but a ragged stumble westward through terrain that seemed designed to swallow armies whole. The Russians weren't just pursuing them, they were herding them, driving them like cattle toward predetermined killing grounds. His company commander, Hauptmann Werner Schultz, crouched behind the remnants of a brick wall that had once supported someone's kitchen. Schultz's face bore the hollow-eyed look of a man who had calculated their odds and found them wanting. The captain studied his map through fingerless gloves, though everyone knew the landmarks no longer existed. The difference between fighting the Soviets and fighting the Western Allies had become brutally clear over the past months. When Brenner's cousin Fritz wrote from the Africa Corps, he described British and American soldiers who fought with discipline and technology, who took prisoners according to Geneva Convention protocols, who maintained supply lines and medical corps. Here, death came differently. The Red Army infantry moved through winter like predators evolved for this exact environment. They didn't just endure the cold. They weaponized it. Soviet soldiers appeared from snowdrifts where no human should survive, materialized from forests that German reconnaissance had declared empty, struck from directions that violated every tactical manual. Brenner watched Gefreiter Hans Müller attempt to clean his weapon with hands that barely functioned in the sub-zero temperatures. Müller had fought in France, where the enemy maintained predictable patterns, used conventional tactics. Here, conventional meant nothing. The metallic scrape echoed again as Brenner adjusted his rifle strap. This time, it sounded like his grandmother's kitchen knife against the sharpening steel, methodical, preparing for work. Schultz folded his map with decisive movements. Intelligence reports indicated Soviet infantry units were converging from three directions. Not the mass formations of earlier campaigns, but small, mobile units that moved independently, communicated through methods German signal intelligence couldn't intercept. What terrified the Wehrmacht wasn't just Soviet tactical innovation, it was their complete adaptation to conditions that reduced German effectiveness to nearly zero. While British and American forces required extensive supply chains, heated shelters, and regular rotation schedules, Red Army infantry seemed to draw strength from the very elements that weakened their enemies. Brenner had witnessed Soviet soldiers emerge from fighting positions they'd occupied for days in temperatures that would hospitalize German troops within hours. He'd seen them advance through blizzards that grounded German aircraft, move supplies across terrain German logistics declared impassable. The psychological impact compounded the tactical disadvantage. Against Western Allied forces, German soldiers maintained their sense of fighting civilized opponents who shared certain cultural assumptions about warfare. The Soviets operated according to different principles entirely. Mueller looked up from his weapon maintenance, his eyes reflecting the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting an enemy who seems immune to the conditions killing your own forces. Every German soldier in the company understood they were facing opponents who had transformed winter from obstacle into ally. Schultz issued orders through hand signals rather than spoken commands. Sound carried differently in frozen air, and Soviet snipers had demonstrated uncanny ability to locate German positions through acoustic signatures. The captain's movements were economical, purposeful, a man conserving energy for what lay ahead. The metallic scrape came a third time as Brenner secured his equipment for movement. Now it sounded like finality itself, the last stroke of a blade completing its work. Intelligence reports from other sectors painted the same picture. German units that had successfully engaged British forces in North Africa found themselves completely outmatched by Soviet infantry in identical winter conditions. The technological advantages that worked against Western Allied forces, superior optics, precision manufacturing, advanced communications, became liabilities when basic functionality required heating elements that consumed precious fuel. Brenner's breath crystallized instantly in the air as he prepared to move. The company would attempt to reach German lines before Soviet encirclement closed completely. Success depended on covering 20 kilometers through terrain that favored defenders who had spent generations learning to survive in conditions that transformed the landscape into an active enemy. The sound of approaching engines rumbled through the frozen ground. T-34 tanks moving with the confidence of machines designed for this exact environment. Their broad tracks distributed weight across snow that would trap German armor. Their diesel engines functioned reliably in temperatures that seized German gasoline motors. Schultz raised his hand, preparing to signal the withdrawal. Every man understood the mathematics of their situation. They weren't just retreating from superior numbers or better equipment, they were fleeing an enemy that had achieved perfect adaptation to conditions that made conventional German tactics impossible. As the company prepared to move through the skeletal village toward uncertain safety, Brenner clutched his rifle with hands that had lost sensation hours ago. The metallic scrape had become silence now, metal too cold to sing against frozen flesh. The metallic taste of spent gunpowder still lingered in the winter air of Berlin as Colonel Hans Dietrich lowered his field glasses for the final time. April 30th, 1945. The Reich Chancellery stood in ruins behind him, its marble facade scarred by countless artillery strikes. Soviet infantry moved through the rubble-strewn streets with the measured precision of men who had learned to kill efficiently over 4 brutal years. Subscribe to witness how different fighting doctrines shaped the final battles of the Eastern Front. Dietrich watched Lieutenant Volkov's squad advance through the skeletal remains of what had once been a grand boulevard. The young Soviet officer moved with the calculated brutality that had become their trademark. No quarter given, no prisoners expected. Each step forward represented not just territorial gain, but the methodical erasure of everything German forces had built in the conquered territories. The bitter irony was not lost on the veteran Wehrmacht colonel. 3 years earlier, when American forces first landed in Italy, German commanders had actually felt a strange sense of relief. The Americans fought with overwhelming firepower but predictable tactics. They valued their soldiers' lives, retreated when casualties mounted, and adhered to Geneva Convention protocols even when their enemies did not. British forces operated with similar restraint. Montgomery's methodical advances in North Africa and later in France were textbook examples of Western military doctrine, systematic, professional, but ultimately governed by rules of engagement that German officers understood and could exploit. But the Soviets had learned warfare in a different school entirely. The sound of Katyusha rockets screaming overhead reminded Dietrich of countless similar moments stretching back to Stalingrad. That same mechanical whine had announced the beginning of Operation Little Saturn in December 1942, when Soviet forces had systematically dismantled the Italian Eighth Army. German troops had watched in horror as their allies were not just defeated, but utterly consumed by an enemy that treated warfare as total existential struggle. Major Brenner emerged from a collapsed basement, his uniform torn and face blackened with soot. The younger officer had fought against all three Allied forces during his 4-year service, and the distinction was etched into every line of his weathered features. "The Americans in Normandy would have accepted our surrender by now," Brenner observed, stepping over the remains of a destroyed Panzer IV. "They took prisoners, established field hospitals, distributed food to civilians." Dietrich nodded grimly. He remembered intercepted Allied communications from the Western Front, American commanders concerned about civilian casualties, British officers organizing humanitarian supplies for occupied territories. These were armies that still believed war had limits, that victory could coexist with mercy. The Soviet approach was fundamentally different. Their infantry had witnessed the systematic destruction of their homeland, entire cities reduced to ash, millions of civilians murdered in occupied territories, prisoners of war left to starve in German camps. They had learned that warfare was not a gentleman's game with rules and boundaries, but a primal struggle where only total victory mattered. Lieutenant Volkov's men reached the intersection 50 meters ahead. Instead of securing the position and calling for reinforcements, standard American or British procedure, they immediately began setting charges on the remaining buildings. No structure would remain intact for potential German use. No infrastructure would survive to aid future resistance. This methodical destruction reflected a deeper philosophical difference. Western allies fought to defeat the German military and restore political order. Soviet forces fought to eliminate German presence entirely, not just the army, but the entire system that had spawned it. Dietrich had served on both fronts and recognized the tactical implications. Against American forces in France, German units could retreat in reasonably good order, regroup behind defensive lines, and often live to fight another day. American commanders prioritized minimizing their own casualties and advancing steadily rather than pursuing total annihilation of enemy forces. British tactics were similarly restrained. Even during the fierce fighting around Caen, German prisoners were processed according to established protocols, wounded soldiers received medical care, and civilian populations were protected whenever militarily feasible. But Soviet infantry operated under different imperatives entirely. They had learned warfare in the crucible of Leningrad's 872-day siege, where survival meant consuming leather boots and wallpaper paste. They had fought through the rubble of Stalingrad, where every basement became a tomb and every street corner a killing ground. They had liberated Auschwitz and Treblinka, witnessing industrial-scale genocide that redefined their understanding of what Germans were capable of inflicting. The Katyusha rockets screamed overhead again, their mechanical whine now carrying a note of finality. Dietrich recognized that this was not just the sound of incoming artillery, but the audible manifestation of Soviet rage transformed into military doctrine. Major Brenner crouched beside a shattered concrete barrier, studying the advancing enemy through his field glasses. "They don't take prisoners unless they need information," he whispered. "And they don't need information anymore." The observation was grimly accurate. German intelligence had documented Soviet interrogation methods that bore no resemblance to Western Allied procedures. Captured Wehrmacht officers reported that Soviet commanders viewed the gathering of tactical information as secondary to the psychological impact of demonstrating that German surrender offered no guarantee of survival. This approach had profound military consequences. German units facing American or British forces could reasonably hope that honorable surrender would preserve their lives. Against Soviet forces, surrender often meant death anyway. If not immediate execution, then transportation to Siberian camps where survival rates approached statistical impossibility. The result was that German soldiers fought with desperate ferocity against Soviet advances, knowing that retreat or surrender offered no meaningful alternative to death in battle. This desperation initially appeared to favor German defensive positions, but ultimately proved counterproductive as exhausted and increasingly outnumbered Wehrmacht units were systematically ground down by enemies who had learned to wage total war. Lieutenant Volkov's squad reached their building. Instead of the cautious room-to-room clearing that American forces would have employed, they simply detonated charges and advanced through the resulting breach. Any Germans inside would be killed by the explosion or buried in the collapse. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants had long since ceased to matter. Dietrich understood that this ruthlessness was not random cruelty, but carefully calculated military strategy. Soviet forces had learned that German resistance was most effectively broken by demonstrating that continued fighting offered no hope of acceptable outcome. Where American or British forces might accept partial victories and negotiated surrenders, Soviet infantry pursued complete elimination of enemy capability. The mechanical whine returned for the third time, but now it carried a different meaning. These were not incoming Katyusha rockets, but the air raid sirens of a city about to fall. The sound that had once announced the beginning of Soviet attacks now served as funeral dirge for the Third Reich itself. Major Brenner lowered his field glasses and turned toward his superior officer. The question in his eyes required no verbal articulation. Both men understood that their military careers, their nation, and quite possibly their lives were measured in hours rather than days. Dietrich removed his officer's insignia and dropped them into the rubble at his feet. After 4 years of fighting against 3 different Allied forces, he finally understood why German troops had learned to fear Soviet infantry above all others. The Americans and British still fought wars they hoped to conclude with reasonable terms and eventual reconciliation. The Soviets fought a war they intended to finish completely, permanently, and without possibility of repetition. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Berlin's destroyed landscape as the 2 German officers walked slowly toward the Soviet lines, their empty hands raised above their heads. Behind them, the mechanical whine faded into silence, leaving only the sound of boots on broken concrete and the distant echo of history closing a blood-soaked chapter that had consumed a continent. Like and subscribe if this historical analysis stood out to you, and write in the comments which aspect of Eastern Front warfare surprised you most.